What happens when a lawyer builds an entire argument on fragile logic, only to have it destroyed by a single, undeniable point? You're about to see how one courtroom moment left an attorney crushed, a jury wide-eyed, and a rival standing tall. The courtroom was supposed to be just another arena for rehearsed arguments. Lawyers had lined up their notes, jurors sat with blank expressions, and the judge looked over his glasses with that usual air of control. But no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The hook came early. The defense attorney, polished, confident, voice sharp like a scalpel, strutted into his opening with the certainty of a man convinced his logic was bulletproof. He spoke with rhythm, each sentence designed to sway, each gesture meant to dominate the room. His words painted his client as misunderstood, his reasoning smooth and seemingly airtight. The spectators leaned in. Some nodded, some whispered. His confidence was infectious, and for a few minutes it seemed as though he owned the courtroom. Every point he made landed with practiced precision. He was untouchable, or so he thought. But across the aisle sat his opponent, calm, silent, unshaken. They weren't scribbling furious notes or scrambling through binders. Instead, they were watching, listening, waiting. And as the defense attorney puffed up his logic, building it higher and higher like a tower of glass, everyone could feel it. Tension rising, anticipation building. The turning point began with a single pause. After finishing his flourish, the defense attorney smirked, confident he had planted doubt. The room gave him that energy back, a ripple of murmurs like applause without sound. He leaned back slightly, as if daring anyone to challenge his fortress of words. That's when the opponent rose, slowly, without fanfare. The chair creaked, the shuffle of papers echoed, and even the judge seemed to lean forward in curiosity. The opponent didn't look rushed, didn't look rattled. Instead, their calmness carried the weight of someone holding a secret weapon. They began softly, no theatrics, just a single measured sentence. "Counselor, everything you've just argued collapses if we look at this one simple fact." The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Jurors froze. The defense attorney blinked. The spectators held their breath. It was as if the air itself had been pulled out of the room. Then came the point. One fact. One undeniable, irrefutable truth. Not buried in jargon, not dressed up in rhetoric. Dressed. It was clean, sharp, and devastating. And in that instant, the tower of logic that had seemed so unshakable just moments ago cracked down the middle. You could see it on the defense attorney's face. The smirk faltered. The eyes darted, searching for footing that no longer existed. The jurors shifted, their expressions changing from uncertainty to realization. The judge's brow furrowed, his pen pausing mid-note. It wasn't just a counterpoint, it was a collapse. One sentence had done what an entire cross-examination couldn't. One line had pierced through rehearsed speeches, dismantled hours of preparation, and stripped away the illusion of strength. The crowd felt it. Gasps broke through the silence. One woman covered her mouth in disbelief. A man in the back whispered, "That's it. That's the case." The courtroom, once a stage for control and confidence, had turned into a theater of shock. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because the moment a fortress collapses, the battlefield changes completely. The opponent wasn't finished. They had only started. And the defense attorney, once untouchable, now stood exposed under the harshest light. The lesson lingered in the air, unspoken but clear. Sometimes the most powerful argument isn't built on complexity. Sometimes all it takes is one undeniable truth. But here's the thing. That single crushing point wasn't just clever. It wasn't just strategy. It carried history, context, and moral weight that no one in the room was prepared for. And when the layers began to unravel, it was not only the defense attorney's case that fell apart, it was his entire reputation. Because what came next would push the courtroom into chaos. The jurors would see sides of the story they'd never been told. The judge would be forced to intervene. And the spectators? They would leave with a story they'd tell for years. The opponent leaned forward, eyes locked on the attorney whose confidence had drained away, and prepared to deliver the next blow. Cliffhanger. But if you thought one sentence was enough to rattle him, wait until you see how the next revelation ripped apart everything he thought he controlled. The defense attorney's smirk was gone. You could almost feel the weight of silence pressing down on him, a silence that was louder than any applause or outburst. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized the balance of power had shifted, and not in his favor. The opponent didn't rush. They knew the momentum was theirs, and they let the silence stretch, building anticipation. It was as if the whole room leaned forward, waiting to see what would come next. And then, with a voice steady and deliberate, the opponent pressed further. "You've argued for 20 minutes, counselor," they said. "But your entire premise ignores the one document sitting right here." They held up a single sheet of paper, simple, unassuming, but the reaction was immediate. Jurors squinted. The audience gasped. Even the judge adjusted his glasses. Curiosity piqued. The defense attorney swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the page as though it were a weapon he had never prepared for. His carefully rehearsed arguments suddenly looked fragile, flimsy, like stage props in the middle of a storm. The opponent began to read, slowly. Each word measured, each pause deliberate. It was not dramatic flair. It was something far more dangerous. Truth, sharpened to a blade. The document contradicted nearly everything the defense attorney had just argued. Facts replaced speculation. Evidence destroyed rhetoric. One juror shook their head in disbelief. Another leaned back in their chair, arms crossed as if silently saying, "Well, that's it then." The ripple effect was undeniable. You could see the shift in the room, the way doubt transformed into conviction in real time. And yet, the opponent wasn't done. They looked directly at the defense attorney and delivered the dagger. "You knew this existed, and you chose not to mention it." The explosion wasn't audible, but it was visible in every expression. Gasps broke the silence. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The judge raised a hand for order, but the damage had been done. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and undeniable. The defense attorney stammered. His words, once sharp and rehearsed, now stumbled over each other like broken glass. He tried to recover, tried to redirect, but each attempt only dug the hole deeper. For the first time, his confidence cracked open to reveal fear. Commentary layered over the scene. This is the danger of arrogance in the courtroom. When you build your entire case on smoke and mirrors, it only takes one gust of truth to scatter it all. And the audience could feel it, not just those in the courtroom, but those who would later see clips, read headlines, and replay the mic drop moment that was already destined to go viral. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about integrity, credibility, and the idea that truth, no matter how buried, eventually forces its way into the light. The defense attorney attempted to launch into a rebuttal, voice shaky, hands gripping the podium as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. But the jurors weren't buying it. The spectators weren't buying it. Even the judge's expression had shifted from neutrality to skepticism. Then came the final blow of the round. The opponent leaned in, voice low but carrying across the room. "Counselor, if your logic can collapse with one sentence, maybe it was never logic at all. Just performance." The line landed like a gavel strike. Boom. Final. The jurors' faces hardened. The defense attorney slumped back, his energy drained, his eyes unable to meet anyone else's. The smirk that had opened the day was now just a memory, and not a flattering one. But here's the twist. This wasn't the end. This was only the midpoint of the battle. Because once a case unravels, the unraveling never stops. More facts were waiting. More contradictions. More cracks in the carefully crafted image the defense attorney had built. And as the opponent prepared to peel back those layers, the tension in the courtroom climbed even higher. Commentary whispered through the narrative. The smirk was gone. The logic was gone. But the truth? The truth was only just beginning to speak. Cliffhanger. And in the next phase, the opponent didn't just dismantle his arguments. They exposed the very foundation of his credibility. That's when the courtroom turned from a stage into a battlefield. The silence after the last line still lingered like a shadow. But what happened next would transform the courtroom from stunned disbelief into outright eruption. The defense attorney shifted in his chair, adjusting papers that suddenly seemed useless, like armor that had been pierced straight through. The opponent didn't gloat. That was the unnerving part. They didn't need to. Their calm composure only made the contrast sharper: arrogance versus dignity, bluster versus truth. Every measured pause felt like a reminder of who was in control now. And then came the next strike. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the opponent began, voice steady, "you were told a story. A carefully rehearsed, dramatic story. But a story is not evidence. And now, we will look at what the evidence actually says." They clicked a remote. A screen flickered to life. Exhibits filled the projection: documents, transcripts, clips. The evidence was clean, undeniable, and devastating. Each slide was another crack in the defense attorney's already fractured argument. The jurors leaned forward, pens scratching notes furiously. The audience whispered in disbelief. A woman in the gallery gasped aloud, covering her mouth. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, but even he couldn't mask his own intrigue. The defense attorney's attempt to interject was almost painful to watch. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, but his voice cracked on the word. The judge raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" The hesitation that followed spoke louder than any answer could. Finally, with a mutter, the objection fell flat. Commentary layered in. This wasn't just a collapse. It was a demolition. Each attempt to resist only proved how weak the foundation truly was. The opponent moved to the next point. One clip played. A prior statement from the defense attorney's own client. The contradiction was glaring, impossible to explain away. Gasps rippled through the room again. The defense attorney's head dropped slightly, as though the weight of it all was crushing down on him. Then the opponent turned back to the jury and delivered the line that cut deepest of all. "You deserve honesty, not theatrics, and what you've just seen proves that honesty was never their goal." Boom. Another gavel strike in the hearts of everyone listening. The commentary deepened. It is one thing to lose an argument. It is another to be exposed as someone who never believed in your own argument in the first place. The jury's faces told the story better than any words could. Their once open expressions had hardened into skepticism toward the defense. Arms crossed, brows furrowed, eyes narrowing. Doubt wasn't creeping in anymore. It had stormed the gates. And yet the opponent wasn't finished. They paused, let the tension hang, and then leaned into the microphone. But perhaps the most telling moment is this one. Another clip played. This time, it wasn't evidence against the client. It was evidence against the defense attorney himself. A prior statement, an interview, a line where he had admitted the very possibility he was now denying. The courtroom erupted. The gallery murmured loudly. One spectator even muttered audibly, "Did he just contradict himself?" The defense attorney went pale. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as though trying to hold on to a case that was already slipping away. The opponent's commentary struck like lightning. "If the truth changes depending on who is listening, it isn't the truth at all. It's manipulation." The weight of that sentence was crushing. It hung over the jury, over the defense, over the entire room. And then, silence again. The kind of silence that feels like thunder just before the strike. The defense attorney tried to recover. His voice shook, his sentences tangled into themselves. He repeated phrases, backtracked, stumbled. The jurors exchanged glances. The audience shook their heads. Every attempt at recovery only highlighted the collapse. Commentary cut in. This was no longer about the case. This was about trust. And once trust evaporates, no logic, no clever wordplay, no desperate defense can rebuild it. The judge finally intervened, voice firm. "Counselor, compose yourself. Proceed if you have something valid to add. Otherwise, the court will move on." The word stung like a reprimand. The defense attorney's eyes flickered with panic, but he nodded, muttered, and sat down heavily. And in that moment, the courtroom belonged entirely to the opponent. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than anything else. Their calm confidence now looked like strength. while the defense attorney's earlier bravado looked like weakness. The commentary turned reflective. This is what makes truth so dangerous to the arrogant. It doesn't come dressed in fireworks. It doesn't need a performance. It stands on its own. And when it stands, no amount of theatrics can knock it down. The jurors scribbled furiously. The gallery whispered. The defense attorney sat slumped, his eyes avoiding everyone else's. And the opponent stood poised, steady, and prepared to deliver the next round of blows. But here's the cliffhanger. This wasn't the knockout blow. Not yet. The most devastating moment was still to come, a single revelation that would transform this case from a collapse into a complete implosion. The narration sharpened. If you thought this was the end, think again. Because the next point didn't just crush the defense's case. It exposed the very soul of the argument for what it truly was. The courtroom had shifted into a living theater. What began as a contest of rhetoric was now something much larger. A reckoning. The defense attorney sat in silence, shoulders heavy, his earlier confidence dissolved into something almost pitiable. The opponent, meanwhile, stood steady, holding the kind of presence that drew every eye, every ear, every ounce of attention. The judge gave a nod. "You may proceed." And proceed they did. The opponent turned to the jury with a calm that carried more weight than 100 fiery speeches. You've heard their story. You've seen the evidence. But what you have not yet seen, and what you must see, is the truth behind it all. A hush fell deeper. Even the gallery leaned in. Anticipation etched into their faces. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm about to hit. The screen lit again. A final document appeared. It wasn't just evidence. It was the evidence, the linchpin, the single undeniable point that dismantled every thread the defense attorney had tried to weave. It was simple, too simple, a single date, a signature, one line of testimony that directly contradicted the central argument of the defense. And in that simplicity lay its power. The opponent didn't rush. They let the jury read it themselves. They let the silence stretch, knowing silence can sometimes scream louder than sound. The defense attorney's face turned red, then pale, then somewhere in between. Finally, the opponent spoke. This one point is all it takes. Everything else collapses under it. Every speech, every story, every attempt to twist the narrative, undone by this single truth. The commentary surged in. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in an argument isn't a flood of evidence. It's one clean strike. And in this moment, that strike landed with surgical precision. The defense attorney leapt up. "Objection. This is taken out of context." His voice cracked with desperation. The judge leaned forward. "Counselor, the document is clear. Unless you can prove fabrication, the objection is overruled." The sound of the gavel rang like a final bell. The audience whispered in disbelief. The jury's expressions hardened further. One juror even shook their head, scribbling something down with a look that said the decision was already made. The defense attorney's collapse was now total. His rebuttals came weak, fragmented. His once smooth delivery fractured into stutters and half-sentences. He glanced at the judge, at the jury, at the gallery, anywhere but the document glowing on the screen. The opponent stepped forward for their closing words. No theatrics. Just steady conviction. You've seen the truth. You've heard the lies. This isn't about clever arguments or dramatic flair. It's about honesty. And honesty requires courage. Today, the courage to speak the truth has prevailed over the arrogance to twist it. The line landed heavy. The jury sat motionless, eyes fixed on the speaker. The gallery fell silent again, reverence settling in. Even the judge paused for a moment longer than usual before nodding. The commentary cut through. This was more than a courtroom battle. It was a lesson. Logic built on deception will always collapse when the weight of truth is applied. Always. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, defeated not by volume, not by aggression, but by the unyielding force of one fact that could not be denied. The judge called the recess. The gavel struck. But no one moved right away. The atmosphere was too thick, too charged. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare, the exact moment when arrogance was crushed by clarity. As the jury filed out, the gallery erupted into murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and whispers spread like wildfire. Did you see how fast it all fell apart? 1 point. That's all it took. The opponent gathered their papers calmly, without hurry, without boast. Victory was obvious. Victory was undeniable. Victory required no celebration. And in that, the lesson rang clear. Truth doesn't need decoration. Truth doesn't need theatrics. Truth, when it stands alone, is enough. The final narration hit like a gavel strike to the soul. Arguments built on ego can be loud, they can be flashy, they can deceive for a while. But in the end, all it takes is one honest point to tear them apart. And in this courtroom, we saw the exact moment when logic collapsed under the unbearable weight of truth. The music swelled, cinematic, pulling every emotion to the surface. The screen faded to black with one final piercing line. Because when truth rises, lies fall. Every time. If you believe truth will always outshine arrogance, share this video. Subscribe for more real stories of power, collapse, and the moments that change everything. Don't just watch, be part of the movement that demands honesty over theatrics.